We're live.
Awesome.
Who all is in the house? Oh, wow. They've been here. Some have been here a while. Auto Salvage Outlaws, he got here an hour and a half ago, so he could be second. Who's first has already dropped off. Colleen Tebow, Robert's here. Aaron, all the way from the other side of the earth, literally. NSB Customs. Gosh, we have fast people talk and the fast people show up.
That's right.
Who all else is here? Mohawk 62, good to see you. Fab Race Mod Repeat. His name would be really easy to get the words into other order, but any way you slice that one, it would work. Pure Pontiac Garage, glad you're here.
Right.
Turbo Tom, Buff's Garage. Jeremy. All right, Jeremy says he's ready for class. Word on the street has it that Crew Cab Dart may be sporting a tunnel ram sometime this year, and that's why we're doing this. People just like him.
Awesome.
Let's see here. My mom is watching. Leighton Welding.
It's good to see everybody.
Yeah, Unfinished Project. Uncle No Identity. Spencer's Food Reviews. How you doing, Spencer? You know, Spencer goes live every now and then and makes videos. Usually it's him chugging something like a Mountain Dew. Everybody's got their niche. Mopars, Mustangs, Minivan. JB's Little Shop. I think I saw Mrs. Dust Devil here. Buff Del Campo. We have both Buffs here now. Wendy English is here. Dust Devil Garage. Terry Grover. Redbeard. See, look at this. We start talking about going fast, and they come out of the woodwork, don't they?
That's right.
Heavens Mopars, Roadkill Customs. He's listening only. Well, Buzz, giving you a shout out. 38 POS Racing, one of the newest members in the No Name 500. He is here tonight. I'm watching his sub count climb. Got his 59 Chevy. Got neat stuff going on over there. Let's see. Greg McDonald is here. LP94. So Lars is here. Party can't really start without Lars. Frank Parks is here. Howdy, man. Creedence Chrysler Revival. Ron English. Blake is here. Jeremy has his pencil sharp, indeed. Blake may be running a tunnel ram before it's all over. You never know. That Dart looks like a good candidate for it. Let's see here. Who else is sneaking in on us? Looks like we're pretty close to caught up. Glad all you guys could make it. Andrew Nelson's here. Speaking of Andrew Nelson, the Nelsons will be on 2 weeks from tonight, January 20th. Rob's Raws and Streetcars. Glad all y'all could make it. But anyway, as y'all can see, those of you watching, our guest is the Andy Wood, Unity Motorsports Garage. And this was a topic I thought was timely because there are so many no-name nationals hopefuls who are thinking about running a tunnel ram in 2023. And I thought, who better to talk tunnel rams with than Mr. Tunnel Ram, Andy Wood. So actually, Andy and I both run a tunnel ram. He runs one on his truck Casper. And I run one on a Honda CRV.
That's right.
Because that was, I thought, an interesting place to jump off and start this. A lot of you guys may not realize you run tunnel rams on dailies and four cylinders and everything else. The factory figured out what a good design a tunnel ram was. Now, it's a different kind of tunnel ram, of course, but it's still a tunnel ram. So I figured we get Andy on to talk about the technology of them, what makes them special, how to select them, all that good stuff. And what, Redbeard's never had a race car without a tunnel ram. Well, enlighten us, Andy. For people who are thinking about it, tell us what the tunnel ram is and all that good stuff and the virtues of it.
Well, first of all, I want to give a little bit of background about me and tunnel rams and how I got hooked. You know, growing up, honestly, my two favorite movies ever is American Graffiti and Two Lane Blacktop. Okay, so Two Lane Blacktop the infamous 55 Chevy with 454 tunnel ram, and they driving it across the country. That's when I fell in love with the tunnel ram. But when I got into high school, our shop teacher, Danny Caldwell, and I've actually got a video on my channel about his car.
I remember that.
So in high school, he pulls in his drag car, and it's a Mustang, Mustang 2. It's a Pentang. That's what I call them. But it's a tube chassis car with a big block Ford with a tunnel ram on it and two 750s. Well, man, I fell in love. You know what I'm saying? Now, this is back in my Mopar days. But, I mean, everything about the car, like I would go to the track with him, and I learned. Now, this dude was a top-notch bracket racer. And the car was running like 580s in the mid-90s, you know, which was pretty dang fast. You know what I'm saying? For in the 80s and 90s. And so I learned, I watched him. I mean, literally, like everything he would do, like he could start the race out and he knew how many jets to put in to change for the weather between the heat of the day and racing at night and keep. That's exactly right. You're cooler if you have one.
For those of you just listening, Redbeard says tunnel rams are like moats. You're cooler if you have one.
Right. So, but the thing about it is, when people talk about tunnel rams, they talk about it in general terms, right? You know, like what John was saying, every modern car has a tunnel ram to some extent. Granted, it's only flowing air and not fuel because they're fuel injected, but they are tunnel rams. And not all tunnel rams are created equal.
Hey, Andy, right there at that point, let's grab Mr. Polo C4's question. Not to interrupt you, but he is asking, because he's one of our young guns. He's in the No Name 500 and says, I'm going to be honest, I don't know what a tunnel ram even is. So I know most people in the chat do, but I know a lot don't. That's a good question. Describe to them what a tunnel ram is.
Well, a tunnel ram is actually a long runner intake manifold. In most setups, it's hang on, I'm getting ready to show you a picture. I don't know how good you can see it.
Hang on a minute. I'm going to put you on solo there.
All right. So the intake on the right is your traditional single plane intake. And then the other two intakes are tunnel rams meant to put one or two carbs on it. It can be fuel injected. It could be whatever. Carbureted. I've seen mechanical injection hats on them. There's many different ways to do it. And but the tunnel ram got its start on a Mopar. Let's just set that straight. From as far as history will dictate, on the high and mighty Ram Charger's car.
Yeah.
If you want to see the first tunnel ram that's been documented, Google the Ram Charger's high and mighty car, and you will actually see it.
They used hoses for intake runners.
Yeah, they pretty much just made a box plenum and used radiator hose going down to Hilborn injector tubes as an intake manifold, and that was the first tunnel ram.
Here it is. So if you can see that, they basically used a box to support the plenum, and then they had hoses that ran down to each intake port on the head. And that very crude contraption was the first tunnel ram.
Yep. That anybody's aware of.
Right.
Yeah, because back then, you have to remember, everybody was doing really crazy things, but they didn't become popular until the late 1960s when about 68, 69. And when Pro Stock took off, that's when in 1970, that's when the tunnel rams actually become a dominant intake manifold. So with that being said, the thing about it is when you're selecting a manifold, and you've only got so many choices to choose from, right? Based on your particular engine architecture. The older manifolds are sized for cylinder heads that were available in the early 1970s, right? This is something that I had to learn the hard way, because whenever I decided I wanted to do a tunnel ram for the first time, I thought, well, I'm going to give it a shot. And I didn't realize how bad it was until I was building the 393. And so to give you a little background, we built DV and myself, we built the 393 for Casper. And the cylinder heads by themselves would flow 315 CFM, right? We bolted the manifold to the head and put it back on the flow bench and flowed it with the entire induction system. There it is. I got to get used to this backward stuff. But you can see the carbs, manifold, everything is on the flow bench. Okay. And immediately that 315 CFM dropped down to 240. That's how bad it really was. So there's not a lot of cross-sectional area in those early manifolds, depending on which one you have. Now, some of them are really good, but what I found is that those manifolds make really good street manifolds because of the narrow, short, the small cross-sectional area makes killer low to mid-range torque because, like I said, they were meant for factory heads. On mixed up Boss, I put a Cleveland tunnel ram on it, and I know that tunnel ram is actually holding back a lot of power.
So we'll get more onto the technology of tunnel rams, but this is a related question. Heavens Mopars has a 383 short block, bored 60 over, TRW high compression pistons. I'm going to take a guess, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong. We're talking, 10.5 to 1, meaning for high compression, something like that. Forged crank and does not yet have a cam. What cam should I use with a wind tunnel ram?
Well, looking at speccing the cam based off of the intake manifold is really the wrong way to go about it. You need to have it all matched together, and think of it this way. You want to cam the motor for the amount of power that you're trying to make with the cylinder heads that you have, and then you need to have a tunnel ram sized the right cross-sectional area, the right length runner in order to achieve that power that you're looking to make. Does that make sense? So if I were going to do that, I would I'm assuming he's got like 906 heads or 452s or something like that on there, and those heads really don't flow a lot of air. And I don't know how much power you're trying to make, but if you're going to run a solid cam, you probably need to be in the mid 240s at 50 thousandths, maybe up to 250 if you want it to be a drag car. I mean, I don't know about the rest of the car and what he's trying to do.
Andrew Nelson has an interesting comment. Amazing how good the tunnel rams worked until experts convinced everyone they were all wrong. And glad he figured out stuff before people tried to stop me from using things.
And that's exactly right. You know, one of the reasons why I was dead set on trying to run a tunnel ram on the street is because everybody on the keyboard racers said it wouldn't work. You know, that's a high RPM manifold.
Fab Race Mod Repeat is asking your thoughts on center squirters versus split squirrels.
Well, I don't know about split squirrels, but honestly,
talk about the center squirter carburetor in general.
Okay, the center squirter carburetor is a unique piece in itself. A lot of people think that it was really designed for tunnel rams, but it really got its start in Trans Am racing. But they work really well on tunnel rams. And the center squirters, they came in two versions. Holly made two versions. One's a 660 CFM, and the other one is an 850. The 850 has down leg boosters and regular style center hung bowls, whereas those, which is my old carburetors, have the side hung bowls. And basically, every time that you open the throttle, you're squirting fuel in all four venturis of the carburetor.
You can see that the squirter arrangement is different on these.
Yeah, the squirter is where the air cleaner stud is. It's actually below the air cleaner stud because that's got provisions to mount an air cleaner on it. And honestly, for one of the things that I wanted to try 660 with is people said those were the most unstreet friendly carbs that you could get. And so challenge accepted for me, right? Well,
Matthew's asking about tuning two carburetors versus one.
There's no doubt that you need to have an understanding of tuning one carburetor, but once you have the principles figured out, it's easy to do. Okay, so we'll get into that more here in a little bit. But right now we're just talking about the manifold itself. But that carburetor, you know, I was able to get 16 miles to the gallon and have great drivability with center squirters.
Mohawk is asking a question about low end torque with a tunnel ram, and you can take this anywhere you want it. You can grab questions, or we can come back to them and make notes. But
well, basically, the way you need to view the older tunnel rams is they pretty much fall in between a regular dual plane manifold and a single plane manifold. They do have really good low end torque. You have better fuel distribution with it, and you have all 8 runners are typically the same length, or they're very close. Whereas a dual plane manifold, if you ever see a dyno curve with a dual plane manifold, typically you'll see 2 peak torques. And the reason why that is because you have 4 longer runners and 4 short runners. So basically the manifold is tuning at 2 different RPM ranges. Does that make sense? Because there's no way around it with a 180-degree manifold, which is a dual plane. You know, you're going to have unequal length intake runners. But the tunnel ram tends to carry that power out further in the RPM range.
Jeremy's asking a parts selection question, which I think is a good one to get to, because a lot of guys find these packages at swap meets and so forth. So it especially applies to them. He has an older wine tunnel ram. It's going on a 402 stroker small block. He's got Promax aluminum heads, CNC. He's thinking of trying 2 Edelbrock 600 mechanical secondary carburetors.
That will be good. That will be a well sought. That'll be a good combination because he's got the cubic inches. Those cylinder heads flow really well. I mean, a lot of people may talk junk about Promax, but I've seen them. Not the Mopar heads, but I've seen the Ford and Chevrolet heads, and I know that they flow really good. So that would make a good combination.
Robert Magny's asking about Offenhauser. There's a kind of a name that's been around forever, longer than any of us. He's asking, are they outdated compared to the new Wyand? Well, how about comparing them to the new to anything? Where does Offenhauser's offerings rank nowadays?
They are the if you notice the plenums in the Offenhauser manifolds, they have a divider in them, and it's basically their way of trying to make a dual plane type manifold out of a tunnel ram. It's pretty weird. If you ever get the chance to see one, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Unfinished project. If you're looking, I'll just address this since they're going back and forth in the comments. If you're looking for the list of No Name 500 entries, if you go to my YouTube channel, that page, they're right there. You really can't miss them. Each that have registered are listed. So SRP is asking a question. Does the header length per cylinder and intake runner length per cylinder matter? Or guess how would you job those things or whatnot? Make that question, take it wherever you want.
Well, the thing about headers is in a perfect world, if you watch DV's header video, they're going to be unequal lengths. The problem with that is based off of the firing order. The problem with that is you can never package that in a traditional car. Now, if it's a tube chassis car, yeah, you probably make room to do it. I think it's just one of those deals where, you know, you're pretty much stuck with what you have, because ultimately you're limited to the architecture of the engine itself. Like, look at a 302 Ford, right, with an 8.2 deck, and look at the runner lengths on, say, a dual plane manifold versus the same dual plane manifold of a small block Mopar. There's a substantial difference between them because of the deck height.
I don't know what the deal is really with this question. I'm looking to build near 500 horsepower 440 with a tunnel ram and have a pair of 600 vacuum secondary Hollies. Should I upgrade to 650s or will my 600s be okay?
The 600 Hollies will get you there.
Yeah, if you gotta get the rest of the engine together, but yeah. I think the 600s will do it if you gotta get the engine, put them on.
Yeah, I was making 600 horsepower with 600, so yeah.
So you're talking about your first experience getting the tunnel ram together, and so you knew you wanted to run one because you'd seen how cool they are, which is undeniable. Nothing looks like a tunnel ram.
Oh, absolutely.
How did your first experience go between when you got it bolted on and actually made it work?
Well, I went through the school of hard knocks, okay, because I first put this thing on the 306 that was in Casper, and had two 600 Hollies on it, vacuum secondaries. And man, it was just the tunnel ram mafia. That's right. But this is a lesson that I had to learn the hard way. Is when do you have too big of carburetors on an engine? Well, when you go wide open throttle and the engine pretty much cuts off because the booster lose signal, that is when you realize that's way too much carburetor for the motor that you're putting it on.
You
Now,
managed to do that on that 306, didn't you? I think you
yeah,
told me.
like you could hold the throttle at 3/4 throttle, and man, it would run like you wouldn't believe. You press it onto the floor, and then it would just sound like somebody cut the ignition off because there was no pull on the boosters from the manifold, no manifold vacuum whatsoever. And how I figured out that that's what it was is I disconnected the secondaries, and then you could go wide open throttle with just the primaries.
Most of the old Partron Ward here is asking, aside from the obvious hood clearance issues, what's the biggest challenge of running a tunnel ram on a street car?
Getting the idle and transfer slots, the idle circuit in the carburetor and the transfer slot dialed in to where it's really drivable off idle.
I'd explain to people what those do because that's a big deal. Your truck, you had that, well, on these carburetors, you had that really figured out on these. It made all the difference in the world. Explain to them what that does and what you did.
Okay, the idle feed restrictors are in the metering block of the Holley carburetor. And basically, think of it this way. Everybody seems to be worried about airflow. No. With tunnel rams, it's all about controlling the fuel. Okay, that is the most important thing because when you have a manifold and you put a 600 Holley on it, well, that carburetor is calibrated from Holley to be somewhere in the ballpark to where the air fuel ratio is going to be good at idle, right? So if you take that same carburetor and you just put another one beside of it, now you have the same idle vacuum, but now you have two carburetors delivering the same amount of fuel as the one carburetor did. So you automatically have to pull fuel out of the idle feed restriction to lean it out. Does that, I mean,
that way you don't have a rich bog all the time right off of
yeah. And, you know, everybody thinks, well, how did you find out about the gas mileage part? Well, that was completely by accident because what I was doing was I kept pulling fuel away from the idle circuit, and then I finally got that ironed out. Okay, I was like, man, this thing, it can sit here and idle. It doesn't burn your eyes. Pull the plugs out. They look good. But then as soon as you give it a little bit of throttle, it would start gargling. And then I'm thinking, okay, well, that means it's fat. So at that point, that's when I really decided to put a wideband air fuel meter in the truck so that I could see what was happening. And it was really, really eye-opening. So, yeah, you can join the mafia.
Yeah, Blake, your car would be a good candidate. So if you want to learn all about tunnel rams, this is the class. We all have a front row seat with instructor Andy.
And so as much as I would love to take credit for learning how to lean out the transfer slot stuff, I can't. I actually was talking to someone on an old forum. This is back when forums was the big thing, you know, and this was way before I got into YouTube. And I can't remember the name of the forum, but anyway, this guy suggested, he said, transfer slots are really too rich. Need to put a restrictor in there. And I'm thinking, okay, Well, then I started looking at it. And then I was like, well, if I drill and tap this little hole here, I can put in a little set screw and make the orifice inside of it whatever I wanted it to be.
Right.
So pretty much creating another circuit inside the carburetor. And once I did that, it was like a whole world opened up to me, because all of a sudden now it would drive just as good as any dual plane manifold car out there. I mean, it was just unbelievable, the difference.
I was talking with Dallas this morning about your truck and the driving manners it has. I mean, you can stop in high gear and pull out in that truck and it doesn't die.
Well, and that's another part of it. Like, you know, I've been working with David Vizard for nearly 20 years. And pretty much when I told him that I was wanting to do it, make a tunnel ram, set up streetable, Googling tunnel rams for sale. But, you know, when I told him about it, he was like, all right. He said, I've taught you all this stuff about Holley carburetors. I want to see what you can do with it. And so really the ultimate was taking those 660s and seeing how drivable that I could get them, and then have him drive the truck and grade me on it. And I've actually got a video on my channel where DV is driving my truck. And he said, Andy, he said, if you can take off in high gear and not use the accelerator pump other than the initial push on the throttle, and it goes through all of the circuits of the carburetor, he said, and it doesn't bug or miss or pop back through the carburetor, you've got it right. And you can see that on my channel.
Jed wants us to mention that Holley used to make tunnel ram specific carbs and that he has 3 pairs of them. So this is a tunnel ram specific carburetor.
Yeah.
It's made for use on a tunnel ram. You notice it's short, it's compact, it is designed for tunnel ram use.
Now, getting into that a little bit, as delivered from Holley, it's terrible other than wide open throttle. It is terrible. If you notice on John's carburetor, I've converted it to 4-corner idle, and there's a lot of differences. It looks the same, but it's not. Those actually have 600 vacuum secondary metering blocks on both the primary and secondary side. And the reason why that is because the idle feed restrictions in those vacuum secondary carbs are a lot smaller from Holley than the 660 center squirter. And the 660 center squirter was a 4160, which never had the rear metering block. So that's effectively a 4150 now.
So you figured out how you want to make this run on your truck, and you've got a drivable tunnel ram at this point. Once you figured out how to restrict the amount of fuel to the amount you want, you got, what was it, 16.1, 16 point something?
Yeah, it's a little over 16 miles to the gallon around town. Now on the highway, like the interstate, it would drop down to around 14 miles to the gallon, because you're turning ungodly RPMs with no overdrive in 430 gears. But even on the 393's last trip, it managed to get over 12 miles to the gallon.
Oh yeah, you still had that. You had 1,000 pounds of gear with you because you took everything but the kitchen sink for racing, and still managed that on the highway.
Yeah, and we were cruising along pretty good. We were cruising along 65, 70 miles an hour.
You were turning what, $4,000 on the interstate?
Yeah, 3,800 to $4,000.
Yeah. That's pretty serious. I mean, understand the numbers he's talking about. That's with what, a 4,500 RPM converter, and 430 gears. And that's also a truck that weighs 4,080 pounds, ready to run.
And another thing too is a lot of people tend to forget when you running a leaner mixture, you need to have more timing in it, more ignition timing, because the burn is a lot slower. And that's where the vacuum advance and really lean mixtures go hand in hand.
So Test the Speed Shop's asking a question here. Now, do you run power valves in both carbs?
Initially, I thought it was necessary. But what I have found is when you have a really healthy motor underneath the carburetors and you're cruising around on the highway 60 miles an hour, the main circuit's not even in play. So the power valve is not necessarily required, if that makes sense, because all of your driving around is in the transfer slot.
Right, that's a good point. That's something that you educated me on and got me to really thinking about, was these engines make so much power with such a small amount of throttle that you stay in the transfer slot all of the time.
It goes back to when you have a single four barrel and you open the throttle a given amount, it takes so much airflow to get to a certain speed. Well, when you add another carburetor, now the throttle blades are closed more because you're getting the airflow, but the blades are rotated less.
You know what? SRP's asking what octane you're running. That's
93 octane.
Right, 93. So you mentioned the last time you drove it with the 393. For those of you who are new, because we do have a lot of new people in here, I'll get this off the wall so we can talk a little bit about it. Tell them about this experience, just because we do have a lot of new people in here.
Well, what you're looking at is the rod and piston out of that 393. Okay, John and myself and my brother was heading to Tennessee to race Bottle Rocket in 2020, and 6 miles across the Tennessee border, that rod did that.
Yep. Somewhere about 5 miles into Tennessee on I-40, there's the bottom half of this rod.
Mm-hmm.
If you find it,
you have
you can authenticate it.
Souvenir. And what caused it was the craziest thing I've ever experienced since I've been messing with cars. Sheared roll pin in the distributor.
So that goes back to what you're talking about with the timing, though. That's what reminded me of it.
Yeah.
But I just like to mention that because we do have a lot of new people in here. And I thought I would grab a picture or two from the side of the road. This was hardcore. So there's the Wood Brothers on the side of I-40. And
that
we're
was a bad day. Very bad day.
Literally patching the side of an oil pan to try to get off the road.
Yeah, because we were in a blind curve. It was yeah, you can see the curve there. I mean, and it was like, okay, we're gonna get ran over.
It was interesting. It was a pretty place to hang out, but it was.
Yeah, we were there all day.
Yeah, we were there a good while before the cavalry came. But you know what? It was a good place to hang out with friends. But that was the ill-fated trip.
It was. And the crazy part is I'd actually had started on Mixed Up Boss before that even happened.
We actually took some combat dress, and I carry med kit and some masking tape, and we doctored up the oil pan, took the roller lifters out of that cylinder, made it about 100 more yards before the crank fouled out and locked up the engine.
Yeah, that was you should have seen us taking a piece of house wire and sticking it down into push rod holes so that
Right
we could
there.
pull the lifters up enough to get it off the cam, but still block off the oil passage so that the rest of the motor would have oil.
There it is. Well, I don't know what kind of wire. I think that was some kind of wire I had with me.
It was. It was like house wire,
Right. Yeah.
electrical wire.
That's exactly what it was. It was exactly what it was. It was yeah, it was wire for a house. It was like 14.2 or something. There's a piece of it. Used a stud to hold it up and took the rocker arms off. It was a valiant effort, but
We tried, and it made it about 100 yards, and then that's when it really grenaded.
so you got so other than that bizarre problem, the sheared roll pin and that kind of thing, what have you done different with this this mixed up boss? What have you done to up the tunnel ram game? Because I know that's been a saga in itself, about over 2 years figuring out the right induction system for that engine.
Well, initially, I was going to put the new Holly high ram on there because it's a really good manifold. And, you know, for all these new people, I did a dyno test on the chassis dyno of the old wine versus the new Holly high ram. And that was back when my channel, man, I don't even know how many subs I had back then, but it was very early. And man, we picked up like 25 horsepower at the rear tires just by switching manifolds. So I wanted to use that manifold, but the problem is when, yeah, MacGyver, yeah, he had everything. Whatever I didn't have, he had, except neither one of us had a connecting rod. And
we had everything but a connecting rod.
But I never forgot what I was talking about.
Now you had done your back-to-back test on the Wind versus the Holly high ram on the 393.
Yeah, so Vizard had nearly 80 hours of porting in that original high ram to try to get it to flow enough air to feed the 393. And even once we got it ported out to where it was paper thin, it still only flowed 275 on the flow bench. You know what I'm saying? It still killed the flow of the cylinder head. So when we took and put that new high ram on it, it picked up 25 horsepower, you know, pretty easily.
So you could take, so pretty much a box stock Holly high ram was outperforming as far as you could go with a Wind cast without getting crazy with like building up weld and
And to tell you, like, this is an example of how bad that manifold is. My cylinder heads were done by Greg Brown, Hammerhead Performance Engines on Mixed Up Balls. He had a customer that built an 8.2 deck mud truck, right? And they dynoed the engine, and he welded up the runners where it was really thin so that they could get a lot more. Hey, it's Mopar Joe. But they welded up the runners so that they could port the manifold even more. Now, this is the old Wine high ram, which is the original manifold that I had. Well, it made really good power. It made like over 700 horsepower, even with that. But when they switched it out and put a custom sheet metal deal on it, it picked up like over 100 horsepower just from putting the proper size manifold on it.
So for those, again, the tunnel ram is a little abstract to some of our viewers. We're talking about a welded up cast intake. We're talking about taking welding rod and building up the size of the intake so that you can port past the limits of its original size and shape.
Yeah.
And so even going beyond any limits of its original size and shape, he still made improvements using a more modern design.
And, you know, that just goes to show you that they're not all created equal, you know, and when picking it, picking the manifold, you need to find something that's sized for the amount of power that you're trying to make, which would make a good video of like how do you do that with cross-sectional area, taper, and all of that, because it all comes into play.
Now, something that we ran into with the dyno session with your mixed up boss down in Charlotte, the numbers weren't quite there. They were a little short. And we noticed it was where the intake gasket was just barely obstructing the port. And I noticed this is something that Just Mopar Joe checked in his latest video. If you haven't seen it on his 400 build, he checked the gasket alignment between the intake and the head when he put the intake on, and really took steps to make that right, used a borescope and everything. If you haven't seen that, that's a great video. I watched this morning.
Absolutely, it is.
Just Mopar Joe's video on matching your intake and head ports together and getting your gasket right and so forth. Joe showed how to not have the experience that we had, but caught and fixed, and just that little bit of gasket mismatch. What was that worth on that engine, Andy? It was better than 10 horsepower, wasn't it?
Yeah, basically, well, first of all, I need to tell what the mismatch is. Okay. Right. My engine is Windsor based, but I have a Cleveland tunnel ram. So the ports versus a Cleveland 4V port and a Windsor port are night and day different. So that last week before the dyno session, I was having to put epoxy in the runners to get the runner shape as close as I could to the Windsor port. Well, putting it together, I had to use a mix match gasket to make it seal up. And what I did is I put silicone around the ports because I didn't want to have a vacuum leak. Now, mind you, I did this at 3 o'clock in the morning on the dyno day. And so when I bolted it on, John was actually headed to my house so that we could take it over there. And by the time he gets to my house, man, I looked horrible, man. I'd been up all night trying to get this manifold to fit because the bolts are not in the right location from between a Cleveland and a Windsor. So I had to get all that port alignment. I was just happy to get the engine to the dyno. Well, we got stuck. If you go and you watch the playlist of the dyno videos, we maxed out at 690 horsepower. And we noticed when we changed the spacers on the carburetors, oh yeah, that
was loaded up to go to the dyno.
Yeah, I had already been up past 24 hours and we hadn't even got to the dyno yet. So anyways, when we changing the spacers out on the carburetor, we looked down in there and you could see just a smidge, probably 1/8 of an inch of overhang of RTV. And Dennis was like, man, that's where the power's at. And I'm like, nah, that's probably 5 horsepower at best. You know, we had that conversation. And Dennis was like, I'm telling you, it's big power, especially on this. And so after we made that 690 horsepower pull, you know, I thought, well, that's going to be it. Well, the engine was still over there. Dennis calls me. This was on Easter Sunday. He was like, do you mind if I trim that silicone up? I'm like, sure, go ahead. Give it a stab and see what happens. And so he did. And it went from 690 to 708. No other changes. So having something in the port disrupting on a tunnel ram is pretty bad.
The difference between a 99% unobstructed port and a 100% unobstructed port was a fair amount of power.
Yeah.
So what else would you suggest these guys that are looking to if you say that they want to run a tunnel ram, they don't know what kind, how do you know what's right for you? What would be the best way to get started in the tunnel ram business?
Well, like I said, it all goes back to how much power you're realistically trying to make. Okay. If you're trying to make, 500 horsepower, pretty much all of those 70s manifolds will get you there. You know what I'm saying? It will get you there with a little bit of port match. It's always better to size the carburetors. I know for a fact that two 600 Hollies will make 600 horsepower. I know that. I've done it. If you're using vacuum secondary carbs, they need to have the vacuum secondary pots connected. What I mean by that is a vacuum hose running from one pot to the other pot. And the reason for that is so that they open it exactly at the same time. Because even though you may have the same springs in the diaphragm, you may have a little bit of leakage in one, or one spring may be a little bit weak compared to the other, and you can get a delay in the opening points.
That was something I noticed on yours, is trying to get them to open at exactly the same time.
Mm-hmm. And another, which brings up a don't. Tunnel ram don't. Don't try to run a progressive linkage on a tunnel ram. What I mean by that is a progressive linkage to where it's running off of primaries off of one carburetor and then open up the primaries on the second carburetor, because you will have terrible fuel distribution if you do that. Another thing when tuning is a lot of people start out saying, okay, I'm going to turn the idle mixture screws out the exact amount for both carburetors, say like 1.5 turn. Okay. Yeah. Shane.
Professor P agrees.
Yeah. And basically, that's not necessarily best for idle air mixture, because you're dealing with manufacturing tolerances inside the metering blocks and whatever. And so don't get hung up saying that every mixture screw's got to be out the same amount. In the same way with jetting, there can be, I was cutting on the wine today when I texted you.
We'll get to that.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
When you're jetting the tunnel ram, because I remember that was another thing that's very specific to it.
Yeah. Basically, when you're dealing with the earlier manifolds, they typically have smaller plenums. Okay. When you have a small plenum on a tunnel ram, it means it's going to pull more fuel from the booster itself, meaning that you will have to lean it out. The larger the plenum, you will typically have to put more jet in it because it weakens the signal to the booster. And that's just the general tunnel ram thing. Like if you have your jetting correct with no spacers on the tunnel ram, and then all of a sudden you add 2 inches of spacer underneath both carburetors, you will probably have to add jet to it because you have weakened the induction pulse pull on that booster itself.
I see B&R asking a question here. What did you finally make, Andy? 770. B&R, you should put that in your engine software and tell Andy what it should make. Put that in your program and let us know. Because his program's got another engine in our community making 480, and I think that's awfully light. Put Andy's engine in your program. I'm curious what it will come up with.
What program does he use? Do you know?
I have no idea. I think it's Windows 95 based, if I had to guess.
But anyways, going back to the jetting on the carburetors on a tunnel ram, don't get surprised that you're going to have big variances in which hole has what jet. You're not going to have 8 jets that are all the same for every cylinder. It's not going to be like that. You can have, as I've seen, as much up to 20 jets spread in a tunnel ram before with DV.
Well, you had to take, was it some jet out of number? Which cylinder was different on yours? Was it 1?
Normally, it's the 2 cylinders that fire adjacent. So, like on a Chevrolet or Mopar, if you follow the firing order, 5 and 7, 7 is going to rob fuel from number 5. Okay. On a Ford that's using the Windsor firing order, it's 6 and 5. It's the front 2 cylinders on the driver's bank.
Real quick, I'll catch this because it was in the comments. Pure Pontiac Garage said it's a long way to 500. Pure Pontiac Garage, a whole bunch of guys in here are going to do it. They're going to get 500. You can do it with them. You can watch it. One-Eyed Cat's going to do it. He's at 198. I've watched his channel come from 0. He's going to be at 500 come Sykeston. That guy, he won't give up. He'll do it. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. And by the way, Andy and I were talking. We were talking what last week. I can remember like it was last week, a few years ago, when both of us had 400 and some subs.
Yes.
we were no name 500 guys before it was a thing.
Yeah, and I haven't forgot,
What are you, 25,000 and something now?
Yeah.
So yeah, you'll get there. It happens.
Another
and Chucky
thing,
went from 60 to 120 this week. So just mentioning that because I saw it in the chat.
Oh yeah, you can. Those guys, if they make regular comments, content, they can get 500 subs.
But I just thought I'd mention that. I thought that was, thought that was interesting because Andy can show you what you can really do if you buckle down. Yeah, Patrick had 7 and he made it.
But going back to tuning, I want to put emphasis on this when you're dealing with carburetors or anything. I'm a firm believer in having dual wideband air fuel meters. Dual widebands, 1 in each bank. But do not underestimate what's happening in your engine, because if you look back in my dyno series, when we had the O2s just in the collector before we moved it into the primary tubes, the air fuel ratio was dead perfect in the header collector. But once we put the O2s into primaries, we had 3 rich tubes and 1 that was dangerously lean. And so those 3 rich tubes can overcompensate for that 1 that's really lean. And if you're just going off of the O2 readings themselves, you can burn a motor to the ground.
And yet, your O2 thinks it's okay.
Yeah. Because what's happened is you've got a 1 lean cylinder and 3 that are overcompensating for it. Just using that as an example, but the spark plugs always tell the story. I just wanted to get that out there.
So the key is you want to be able to use an O2 because it's a very valuable tool in the toolbox, but don't use it at the expense and saying it's a replacement for learning how to read plugs.
Well, that's exactly right, because when I first started reading plugs, I thought, well, that's good, thinking, well, that's got to be like 12.5 to 1. You know what I'm saying? What I thought was right and what the O2s taught me was I was way off, as far as my plug reading. And so once you have something to establish a baseline, then you got something to work from.
while we're talking about that tuning individual cylinders, Fab Race Mod Repeat says header tube temp will tell you a lot when running a tunnel
You
ramp.
can do it with EGTs, or you can do it with O2s. Yeah, that's exactly right.
By the way, we'll give a shout out to Greg Finnegan with his dyno in Charlotte, the race engine dyno down there. We had a good experience with them. I mean, yeah, setup did take a while, but the experience was really good. Really experienced dyno operators that run an honest dyno that really shows you where you stand. I like those guys. They did a good job.
Yeah, and when I tuned that engine on the dyno, this is something that most people need to understand too. When you tune an engine on the dyno, then you put it in the car, guess what? You got to do it all over again because the dyno loads it different than what you see in the vehicle. When it's running on the dyno, it's in a static state. There's no G forces involved, of going down the track. But when you take it to the track, man, you're going to have to go through a whole different learning curve. So just keep that in mind.
Well, the other thing about a dyno, we've discussed this recently because it's come up with all the dyno stuff, the piston flipping stuff, and all of it went together, is that the dyno will go up at either, depending on how they have it set, 200 or 300 RPM per second increments, but it starts loaded. So things like accelerator pumps and all these things that are important for drivability don't get to come into play on the dyno. So that's why you have to.
Yeah, because the dyno itself is physically holding the engine back instead of the other way around.
Right.
The engine's not free revving.
Yeah, the engine driving with the dyno is a whole lot different than driving with a vehicle.
Yeah. And I can't really give enough credit to DV. And if you really want to know about tuning carbs, my first suggestion is buying his Holly book. He's got a really good Holly carb tuning book that if you look closely, I'm in that book. I'll just leave it up to you to figure out where I'm at.
Yeah, the DV books are good. You can find them. They're valuable. Kenny Whidden says the best dyno is a time slip. Agree with that.
Mm-hmm. And it's just like anything else. I mean, anybody who's experienced, we experimented with spacers. This is something that you really cannot test. You can test carb spacers on engine dyno and get results, right? But you don't know if that'll translate when you get to the track, because like I was talking about, the signal to the booster, especially on a tunnel ram, it needs to be done at the track, because what happens is when you start getting too much plenum volume, it will not recover on the shift. So when the RPMs drop back, the carb gets confused, so to speak. And so if you have too much plenum volume there, it can get you into trouble.
Barrow's Garage has a question. He's asking you, is it true that tunnel rams like compression, and how little can you go and still be worthwhile to run a tunnel ram? You want to unpack that one and answer it?
Yeah. I personally would not put one on. The worst experience I've ever had with a tunnel ram, and I still was able to make it drivable, but it was not the right manifold for the job, was a T-bucket that had like a GM 190 horsepower 350 in it. One of those replacement 350 deals that they used, good wrench 350. And those motors are like 8.5 to 1 compression, no camshaft, and it was just a complete dog. And the reason for that was it had really high manifold vacuum at idle. And man, it would just fuel soak the plugs because of that. So I had to take away so much fuel out of the idle circuits and transfer slots just to be able to make it halfway drivable. But it wasn't right. It should have had a really small dual plane on it. But
Well, let's turn the question around the other way. What engine would be a good candidate for a tunnel ram that you may see running, say, a regular single plane? That you say, you know what, this would be a better off having a tunnel ram.
well, like if you actually have say a really hot street engine, something that's 10-to-1, you got a fairly healthy cam in it with converter, and you've got a single plane on it, chances are you will pick up, depending on the manifold and the situation, you're going to pick up more power under the curve with that tunnel ram manifold when it's right than you will with that single plane. You know, a lot of people, and I can vouch for this, when we were doing dyno testing on DV's Holly book on car boosters, right?
Yes, sir.
Most people go from a dual plane and put a single plane on it and realize there's a huge amount of low end torque loss. But, oh, well, it's got to be the single plane manifold. Well, what they don't realize is they had a straight leg booster in the carb with the dual plane, and it worked really well. Well, you need to have more fuel atomization when you go to a single plane. And if you get like a good step down leg, the torque loss down low is nowhere near what it would be with just a straight leg booster. And I've got videos on all that. And Shane's right. He said if it works with a single plane, it'll work better with the tunnel ram. I agree with that.
Basically, what you're saying, though, what you said earlier with the compression and converter, if you have a pretty well maximized street package, if your package is pretty well maximized to work on the street with compression, cam, converter, and so forth, at that point, the tunnel ram could be a good next step.
That's right.
And you're saying making power under the curve, which means instead of looking for that peak number, you're actually making torque, you know, in a usable range, which is very important for especially a street car.
Now, I'll tell you when tunnel rams are not good on street cars. You want to hear this story?
Yes, sir. Of course.
All right. So the wife and I, we decided to drive Casper to Asheville. Asheville, from me, is up in our mountains, the North Carolina mountains. And it was in the middle of winter. And like I said, I daily drive this thing, you know.
Yeah, haul the mulch and everything else.
Yeah. So, but we take off to the mountains. Well, that particular night, it got down to 7 degrees. Okay. And this is something that you have to really be concerned with is once it gets that cold, you'll have carburetor icing problems. The carburetor will actually freeze up from the air going through it. So that's something to be aware of. The next thing you know, you've got a stuck throttle and it's running like crap. But when it's 7 degrees, you probably don't want to drive it.
That's a good point. You got to be really hardcore to ever have figured that out.
Yeah, well, 9-to-1, 460, need to step it up in compression. Oh yeah, that'll work really good. But like I said, you know, it's about the combination with the cam, the heads, and the intake. And the thing about when you go into 521 inches, the motor's going to make so much torque down low. You know, you're not going to experience a loss in low end torque at all.
So this is maybe a little bit off of tunnel rams in general, but this is one of our registered no-name 500 contenders, Mr. Polo C4. And he's asking an in general question. So this would be a good one to get Andy in on. Before anything else, what would you do to the car? And he's talking about his stock engine. So you have a stock engine, let's say it is a C4 Corvette. What will probably be his next step to say, I want to make it faster or whatnot? What would you recommend?
So if it's a perfectly stock car, man, it's about getting air in and out of the engine itself. You know, better intake manifold, better cylinder heads, better camshaft, changing the manifolds off the engine.
What would you do first? What would be the first thing you do?
Well, you start out typically with the bolt-ons, you know, with header and intake manifolds before you digging into the camshaft and changing heads and stuff like that. That normally comes later. Proper induction, yeah. That's the route I would go.
And Joe is trying to help Mr. Polo C4 make it to the No Name Nationals. If you want to see a list of all of the registered No Name 500 channels who are working on getting there, you can go to my YouTube homepage, just the homepage, and you'll see a list of them with their sub counts right there. So just mention that. He has already done MagnaFlow exhaust from the axle back.
I would start at the engine, put a set of headers on it, which headers on a C4 are fun.
Yeah, I bet.
But, you know, the basic stuff.
Infamous Nova would like to come out to No Name Nationals. We hope you can. Either as participant or spectator. We'd love for you to be there. Danny Boyd's changed to heads but never a cam. I don't know if I should say he's lucky or deprived.
Punters are saying that it's an L98, and I don't know. I don't know what it is. You know, if
L98 is a good factory intake, a cam and headers with a tune. I don't know. It's something I've never worked on.
Yeah, L98's got a pretty decent intake.
Yeah, Andy's worked on a lot of stuff. You know, that's something that's interesting. So most people from YouTube, of course, because we all know that we're always judged on only what we've done on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
Like we never did anything before that. So all that stuff we did to get here, the first 40 years of our life, people are like, they don't know that exists. So tell these fine folks who know Andy Wood for having that monster mixed up boss in Casper, some of the neat stuff you were doing before that.
Well, believe it or not, I ran a shop for years and, you know, did a Pro Charge GTO with a Pontiac engine, 389, with a blow through. So, you know, that's one example. Then building late model fuel injected Mustangs. See, what most people don't understand is I started out carburetor, went total fuel injection, guru, getting into all that. Then I reverted back to carbs. So
love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. So just to tell people, so first of all, Andy and I chat off of YouTube because he's just a great person. And I'll tell you. And if he wasn't, I would never say that, because there's a lot of people who are he's every bit as humble and down to earth off of YouTube as on. This is just him, right?
And so I mean, and I don't know everything. I'll be the first one to tell you that.
But he's the real deal. So I've got pictures and things. Let me see if I can find some of this stuff is really neat. So check this out. Here's one I happen to have, and I had this for tonight. Tell us about this guy and what you're working on there.
That is a 14-year-old me working on a 70 Plymouth Duster, my first car. Yep. That is me. Look at that.
Look at all that hair.
Oh my gosh.
You've got a good story or two or 12 with that car too. I
mean, you
We
know,
think of Andy as Mr. Straight Lace, never get in trouble, but that's not always been the case. You should tell them a little bit about that.
well, let's see. What do you want to know?
Well, it was 30 years ago, so you're past the statute of limitations. I mean, it
Oh
doesn't.
yeah, having that car in high school got me in a lot of trouble. I will say that, because that car, by the time I was, say, 18, that car was pretty quick. So quick enough to get me into big trouble.
Yeah, I think you.
No, I was past the mullet, Dan. I was past the mullet years.
Now,
I done got rid of it.
was that the first car you made a pass in at the track? Was that Duster?
Yes, 14
Okay.
years old.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
And it was a slow 9-second 8th mile at Shady Side Dragway.
And you did that with full permission and blessing to do so, right?
Oh yeah. So my parents, they said, well, okay, you can do it, but your brother's got to ride with you. Like, he's going to make it better by riding with me. You know what I'm saying? And I've got a picture of us going down Shady Side the first time together.
Here's another picture of that car. You got to remember now, this was 30 years ago, so even that picture really was square, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Andy, he's known for the Ford, but he's got a lot of credibility in the Mopar world too.
See, I was into Mopars when you couldn't buy parts for Mopars. John knows what I'm talking about. The only parts that we could get was leftovers that everybody wanted an arm and a leg for. There was no aftermarket cylinder heads. There was no really good intakes. They didn't even make a Performer RPM for small block Mopar. You had to have the LD4B or a Holly Strip Dominator, something like that.
And this is just, while I have it, this is that. I think I probably took this right on the side of the road.
Yeah.
There's the distributor gear that came free with a broken roll pin.
Yeah.
So I just came across that, but anyway, you were a Mopar guy way back in the day.
Yeah.
How did you make the switch over to brand F?
You're not going to believe it. So my buddy Keith Williams, this was back around maybe 2000, and he wanted an SS Camaro. Okay, well, I'm at a car lot over in Charlotte, and I was like, man, they don't have a SS Camaro over here. And this is before cell phones, really. But they had a 96 Cobra over there. This is back in the age of beepers, And so we went and drove this 96 Cobra, and man, this thing was quick. I was like, man, this is all right. So we took it straight from the dealership and went to my house, grabbed the slicks off the Duster, because it's the same bolt pattern, 5 on 4.5, because I had a big body rear ending car, and we had the Shady Side. And man, that car, we ran a 866 at 8th mile, completely bone stock down to the paper filter in it. And I was thinking, man, this is insane. And so we put a gear in it and did all this stuff. And my car, the Duster, had J heads that were ported by me. By this time, it had I don't know if I'd switched to solid yet, but it had, because I went through the progression. I went from the 484 purple shaft to the 509 purple shaft, and then I went to the 528 solid. Anyways.
We have a super chat here from Professor P, Slant Daily Garage. Thanks. I appreciate that, sir. I have seen that different tunnel rams liked different length exhaust primary tubes for different wave tuning. Have you seen the same thing?
Yeah, we talked about that earlier, but like Shane, getting um getting that exhaust package to fit in a chassis of a car, unless it's a tube chassis car, is kind of hard to do, and but you're exactly right. But yeah, that 340 of mine, it was like, pretty rowdy, 11-to-1, ported J heads, first set of heads I ever ported, really didn't know what I was doing. And yeah, and my car was running, 760s.
Yeah, Colleen brings up a good point I'll mention real quick, and that's that the people on my page are the No Name 500. There's a whole lot more coming. That's just the No Name 500 guys who need subs to get there. Not saying I won't put everybody on there eventually, but I've started with them. Everybody going gets in the book. This is the new book. I haven't even decorated it yet, but yes, yeah, everybody. There's a lot more people coming than what you see on the page there. I thought I'd mention that. Let's see. So now I think it'd be neat to tell them about you. You got into the whole mod motor thing.
Yep.
And you went down that route. I think that's an interesting story because you think about it. You started with carburetors. You started with an old Mopar. You started where I started and still am. But then you went into a whole different world.
I did.
Now you're kind of coming back. But tell us about the whole mod motor experiment.
The mod motor deal was really based off of that Cobra. That car really lured me in because we got that car to go really fast and didn't have hardly anything done to it. And then I thought, well, if we did this good with a Cobra, I'm going to go buy a 96 GT. Mistake. It was a complete.
Thank you, Punisher. I appreciate
that.
How did we get from the Cobra to the 96 Mustang GT?
So Keith bought that Cobra, and I was sitting there thinking, well, if we can do this with a Cobra, I can surely do this with a GT, a 2-valve car. And man, it was horrible. The first pass at Shadyside went 972 at 72 miles an hour in second gear. It had a 273 gear in it from the factory. And I was thinking, man, my buddies, they gave me such a hard time. They was like, you just bought a pig in a poke. And
what was your Duster running?
760s.
So you got the Duster into the 760s.
Yeah. And so I'm thinking, where did I go wrong here? So it was a non-PI 4.6. And so what I did is I bought a set of junk non-PI heads, welded the chambers up because it's an open chamber head. We welded the chambers up to get the compression up, and I started progressively going through the bolt-ons with fuel injection, and I had that car running 10s in the quarter in a matter of a few years on motor. And then when Trick Flow come out with the TFS head with it, that was a game changer because I was able to get close to 300 CFM out of those heads. And the motor went. People ask me all the time, like, which motor do you like more, mixed up boss or the 2-valve mod motor that's in now Micah's car because I sold it to him.
Now in a Fairmont.
Yeah, I'm actually more proud of that 2-valve 4.6 than I am mixed up boss. I mean, it was making over 2 horsepower per cubic inch, made right at 640 horsepower out of 304 inches naturally aspirated. But that's 14-to-1 compression with the cylinder heads. the biggest camshaft that Bullet could make for us. I mean, so, and that car, we took it to the Mod Motor Nationals in 2017 and 2018, and we won it both years back to back, and it was running 8s in the quarter.
Buff here is I appreciate the super chat, Buff. Buff is a big advocate of signing up and signing up early. I'll just say this because I don't want anybody to think it's conflict of interest, because yes, you know, we want people to register. It's your gamble to make, but as we saw last year and as we're already seeing this year, people who do sign up early, they tend to get way ahead on getting their subs early. And right now there are only, I believe, 6 channels actually registered for the No Name 500. So I believe it was Infamous Nova asking how he gets his name. Yeah, name on the page. Well, I just stick the No Name 500 guys registered on my page. So if you go to nonamenationals.com and register and you have fewer than 500 subs, I automatically will put you on my YouTube homepage. But that said, we support all the channels that are going. But right now, I'm not trying to go out of my way to help drive channels, drive subscribers to Andy. Andy has a few more than 500. Andy's got just a few more. So, you know, and like just Mopar Joe, yeah, all these guys, we all, you know, work together in the community, but they have their subs. So we put special emphasis and help behind the guys trying to get to 500. So that's what that's all about, if you're curious. But it's all about community building. That's the entire point of 500 subs. So anyway, just digressing for a minute because we had some questions about that. But you had a lot of success with that 4.6 mod motor. You held a record with it. What record did you hold with the mod motor?
Well, as far as I know, we are still the fastest nitrous mod motor car in the country. I mean, you know, it's been low 5s in the 8th mile.
Man, wow.
You know, but the thing about it is we're at a point to where we really can't. I've been trying to get Micah to do the turbo deal for a while, you know, because you can only stuff so much nitrous in a 300 cubic inch engine, you know. And when you actually have the GoPro mounted in the cowl of the hood and you see the nitrous coming back outside the carburetor at the top end of the track, I mean, you've hit a wall.
Right.
It cannot digest anymore.
Yeah, that I thought that was really cool. You've had a lot of success with it, and that Mustang that you ran the number in is now getting a Ford Godzilla.
That's right.
And the motor is now in a Fairmont wagon.
Yeah.
Which should be really exciting to watch. I think he's already made a few outings with that.
Yeah, he took it to the Mod Motor Nationals this year and run it, I think, in open comp, and was doing really well with it until split the case in the Power Glide. We'd put probably 500 passes on that stock Power Glide case, and it just killed it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, though, to start finding the limits of what the drivetrain will handle.
Yeah.
And you're going to start finding the limits in your truck.
Oh, yeah.
So now you've come back around. You did the fuel injection experiment and also, you know, running alcohol fuel. I think you were running E85.
Yep. We were running E85 back in the day when it first really became a thing around here. And the reason why we quit running it is because we started running heads up class that wouldn't allow us to run it.
All right. Peckerwood Customs Aaron here has a good question for you. Is there a rough calculation to work out the CFM required for the engine? My tunnel ram came with 450s I suspect are going to be way too small. He's got 360J heads ported to the hill. This is a great question for me because that's what we're thinking about doing on a 340.
Yeah.
How would you answer that, Andy?
I would say on a really healthy 360, you will see gains going to a 600. Another thing that you really need to pay attention to with tunnel rams is having a booster in the carburetor to atomize the fuel the best you can. Because the further that booster is away from the intake valve, the more important it becomes. So if I had a set of 600s that had a set of step down leg boosters, I think that would probably be perfect for that combination, depending on how much cam he's running and how much compression and all of that. But, you know, the 450s, it'll run out of steam pretty early if it's making a good amount of power.
Very worthy question. So now you're doing an experiment running the Dominators.
Mm-hmm.
And you haven't run Dominators before, right? So this is your first vehicle with the
not
Dominator.
on the street. I played with them on race cars, you know, and so I've got a whole new learning curve to figure out. But the principles are still the same, you know. Honestly, if I'm being 100% honest, because you got to remember, Casper is more than just how should I say it? It's a daily driver that I just happen to race. Okay. And but I do believe it would be faster with two 4150s on it versus the Dominators. I honestly believe that, and I'm going to test that. But for the sheer look of the engine itself, two Dominators was the only choice. You know what I'm saying? Now, granted, there are only two 750 Dominators. Okay. I've got a set of Pro Stock Dominators that I'm really reluctant to test, but I think I'm going to, just to go the other direction when I do that 4150 test.
Well, you know, too, that you're giving up a little bit with the intake design you're running, but you make these concessions because that truck is just so old school cool, and
Yeah,
you don't want to disrupt that. And I appreciate that you make concessions for that.
there was a question. Oh, yeah.
Thumper, thanks for
Thumper.
Super Chat. I appreciate it. And 38 POS Racing, he was registered in there early, and he's on my page. You can check him out. Guy makes a long road trip in a 59 Chevy. He was at the No Name Nationals in 2022. We look forward to seeing him again, but he's in there. He's in there trying. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah. Since Shane is in here, I'm really itching to get a pair of the new Edelbrock carburetors, the dyno test, because I think that would be a really cool dyno test, that new carburetor, because that thing is trick. The VRS 4150.
The first one I saw was at PRI. Yes, they are.
They're bad.
You got to really look at those things up close to just see how many improvements they made when they put that out. They did their homework with that carburetor.
Yeah.
Edelbrock
fixed all of the crap that Holly should have done years ago. If that makes sense.
Exactly.
Based off of the pictures that I've seen. But
yes, with the Dominators too, you're also looking at the way they I'll do that, Andy. You're also looking at the way they distribute fuel too, because the Dominators are spread out. The barrels are spread farther apart from the center.
In my reasoning, you know, I really think, now this is my hypothesis, not anybody else's, but you know, when I explained it to David, he thought, you might be onto something. With a larger bore throttle blade, I could get more airflow with less throttle opening. Okay. Therefore, you got to remember, when the throttle blades are closed, you're in a high vacuum situation. And the more you open that throttle, the vacuum drops. And so I really believe that I can get good fuel economy with Dominators. And the Dominators have an intermediate circuit, which is what those Edelbrocks, they actually have an intermediate circuit past the transfer slot, which really intrigues me because I think a lot could be done with that on a 4150.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've talked a lot about leaning out the idle feed restrictions and the transfer slot, but when you do that, your accelerator pump circuit has to be spot on.
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand? Because
Oh,
it's
yeah.
got to be, if you're running a really lean mixture, I mean, typically people flip out that I'm trying to run my engine at 15-to-1 air fuel ratio at cruise. But what you need to understand is that's just, there's no load on the engine whatsoever. And the closer you can get to 16-to-1, that's where most fuel economy can be achieved. But once you go past 16-to-1, then you start getting into really surging and all kinds of stuff. And you have to have a really good ignition system to run a really lean air fuel ratio, because it has to be able to light it off. It becomes harder to light. At what power level is a sheet metal intake worth it? Well, I would definitely say that I'm at that level with
Yeah.
boss, because, you know, there's just simply not enough cross-sectional area in that manifold to support that many cubic inches. And you got to remember that manifold was designed for 351 inches. It wasn't designed for 429 inches. And it's really based on the amount of power that you're trying to make. When you start getting past 600-700 horsepower, that's when you will probably see gains from sheet metal intake manifolds, because you can get a more purpose built for the application.
So we see a lot of Pontiac talk in the comments because we got a lot of Pontiac contingent. Looks like they're going to descend upon the No Name Nationals this fall. And
That's good.
yeah, I know. I think it's great. I want them to bring it.
Here's
And,
a little bit of trivia for you.
Yeah.
How did my brother end up being a Pontiac guy and I wound up being a Mopar guy growing up?
That's a good one. Anybody want to take any wrong answer only guesses?
Because Dad, before the Duster, had a 68 Ram Air 2 Firebird. And that car was bad. I got a picture of me sitting in between the bucket seats when I was real little. Bought that car for $800.
Yeah, the Fords are coming. You know, we had quite a bit of Mopars there last year just because I'm a Mopar guy and a lot of my friends are Mopar people, and Andy's a closet Mopar person. But
hey, watch it now. Watch it.
The Fords are coming, though. No doubt about that.
I'm into everything. I mean,
Yeah.
really. Now,
Totally.
I'm not. The one thing that I really hadn't got in, you probably have more experience with this than me. You did an LS swap before it was a thing.
I did. You could actually see that on my channel.
LS swap. I mean, you know.
I've got video of that on my channel way back there. I did an LS swap forever ago. You couldn't even get the kits back then. And for the most part, it fits in a third-gen Camaro pretty well. And I like the LS. The LS is a good engine. I will never say it's not a good engine.
It's a great engine.
Yeah, it is. The LS, okay, when Andy and I were, say, teenagers, you didn't have the LS. What you had was the 350 Chevy. That was the common as dirt engine that everybody's like, yawn, it's a 350 Chevy.
Yeah.
The LS is getting to be that way now just because it's so plentiful and popular.
Yeah. And they've been out for 25 years almost.
believe it or not, now it's kind of getting to the point where when I see something and I look under the hood, knowing that they've done some kind of modern swap, and I see a small block Chevy, I'm like, well, that's cool. They went retro instead of an LS.
They
I never
went to
thought I'd
what,
say
LS
that.
in 96, 97?
Something
Because
like
you had
that.
LT1 in 90, like 94 or 95. I don't
Yeah, yeah.
remember that,
It's
but
right in
it was
there.
in the 90s.
All I remember was trying to do so a friend of mine, he made a swap in his Camaro. But what he did is he put an LT1 in it in
Mm.
his third gen Camaro. And I remember that we had to take the engine completely out of the car to put an oil pan on it because of the way the timing cover and the oil pan interlock on them.
Yeah.
It was just, I just thought that was crazy. But
Yeah, what's funny is like I actually got my start working in a Chevrolet dealership. And one of my first big jobs that I had was pulling a motor out of an LT1 Camaro from the bottom. So that was pretty interesting. Don't get me started on the OptiSpark.
oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. That I actually think I'd have to look. I think that's on my list of things that should never have been invented.
Yeah.
Yeah, Infamous Nova says behind on the comments. Just as a general note for you guys that watch lives, especially where there's a lot of comments you're trying to keep up, you'll see on the left-hand side under our window a little button that says live. And if you click that, if you have gotten just a little bit behind, because like your internet connection speed or buffering or whatever, it will catch you up to the current time. Because over the course of a live, over the course of an hour, you'll find yourself drop back a little. And if you're 30 seconds behind in a chat that moves this fast, it makes a difference. Old Richard RJ, Calvin Nelson will be live on this channel 2 weeks from right now. We'll have Andrew and Calvin, and there you go. It's already done, already booked. They're
I
good
think
friends.
it's
They've been on
amazing
here.
what they've done with those 4.2s, man. The
Yep.
Mariberas, those things are impressive.
Yeah, fourth gen F body with half the engine under the dash. No, thank you. I like the engine, but I like the third gen better.
Yeah. That was just a bad deal.
I'm just not into things like that. I'm just really not. I like things that are simple and functional and work. So A Cove is asking a question here. Andy, would you recommend down legs for a cross ram as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Cross rams are a little bit different animal as far as fuel distribution, but they can be made to work really well. And I like on any cross ram or tunnel ram, the bare minimum booster you want is a down leg booster, preferably a step down leg or annular. The problem with annulars in 4150s is the traditional annular booster is too big and it blocks air fuel. And they want to go really rich in the RPM range. As you go pull more RPMs, they will get richer and richer. Unless you have one of the special boosters that John has in those 660s, which took a lot of work to do, but they're a smaller annular booster.
Those are eventually going to find their way onto a tunnel ram 340. So you'll see them again. But they actually live in my office. I don't even have them in the garage. They stay in here.
Yeah. They're a pretty special part of Casper. I will say that.
Hey, Infamous Nova, the best place for that is on the lives I do with Dallas, which I'll do another one next week. Later, JB. Anybody else have any questions for Andy? Got a few more minutes here before we wrap up.
You can always tell me how crazy I am for trying Dominators on the street.
Dizzy Izzy's coming back. That's very good.
I still think I have a video somewhere of him at the gate.
Yeah. Dizzy Izzy was one of 2 channels panhandling at the gate in 2022.
Me and Dallas did that. Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, no, he was doing it earlier. That's right. Yeah. That's right. Dizzy was doing it earlier in the summer. And I thought that was really cool. But I'll tell you what, he worked hard and he made it.
He did. Anybody can make it. You just got to put forth the effort.
I got my desk catty corner in here, which you can tell from the wall.
Yeah.
So I either sit this way, so I got an armrest on this side, or I sit this way with an armrest of the file cabinet. Either way, it looks weird, but if I don't, I can't get comfortable in this chair. Just bizarre. I find myself switching back and forth sometimes. Scarlett the Four-Eyed Coot is asking, did the carb tuning class take place at No Name Nationals 22? And is there a video of it? There's lots of video of Andy doing some carb tuning there. Hopefully the only carbs he'll be working on in 23 are his own.
Yeah.
So any questions about just general performance, anything tunnel ram? Okay, speaking of tunnel rams, we were in a live, I guess it was Wednesday night, and the UR19 came up, and of course you appeared, just like magic.
Mm-hmm.
You think you're going to try to source one of those for your engine?
If I can find one of those unicorns, I will definitely give it a try. What John is talking about is back in the 70s, Edelbrock made a tunnel ram for the Cleveland. It was called the UR19. And that tunnel ram is basically the one all of the pro stock guys ran. I'm talking Bob Glidden, Dyno, Don Nicholson. The Wyand, not so much, because there's a big difference in them. But, you know, I could make that manifold that I have work more or better suited, I guess that's the right way to say it, is if I would weld up the outside of the runners and straighten the runners out. Because if you notice, most tunnel rams do this right here. They come in and then they go out. Well, air and fuel is really heavy. It's a lot heavier than most people realize, and it's lazy. Air wants to go straight. So if you can straighten that out, it will definitely run better.
Credence here is asking a question you can talk about a little bit. He asks, have you done anything with propane mixers on a tunnel ram?
I have not. I have not messed with any propane.
Well, have you used propane to find a vacuum leak?
Yeah, other than that.
Right. Let's see. We gotta lean on our friend Drag Boss to get registered and come out to the No Name Nationals. So I'm just mentioning it here because I don't see Tim in the chat. If he just happens to get comments show up under his videos that says he needs to get registered, maybe he'll take the hint. And I think mention him because he has a couple of UR19s.
Oh, yeah.
He's got all kinds of good hardware over there.
Hopefully, me and him, we've actually talked. When he takes the Cougar out, I'm hoping to make it up there to see it run.
Yeah.
That's one trip I want to make. And he's actually got a Cleveland that I'm going to try to get my hands on. So more will be revealed on that.
Uh-oh.
Road.
Uh-oh. Andy doing Cleveland stuff.
Yeah. I don't know what I would put it in, but I've always had a hankering to build one.
Two Hack says he's working on it. And that right there is enough. You should be scared.
That T-Bird is going to be pretty nasty. You
His
know,
T-Bird,
people,
everybody thinks it's a Cougar at first glance, but no, he
yeah,
built a T-Bird like that.
that T-Bird is going to be pretty intense.
Yes, David Leonard. Hank Hill knows everything about propane and propane accessories.
That's exactly right. There was a question, I can't remember who it was, about asking about starting out with vacuum secondaries versus double pumpers on tunnel rams.
Right?
You know, honestly, if you get the vacuum secondaries dialed in, they're really not too much difference, because if you go back, I've got a video where I compared my 600 vacuum secondaries against the center squirters. Center squirters, I swapped them at the track that day, and it was not that much different ET wise. But what you have to realize is I had hundreds of hours probably, and I'm probably exaggerating that, in getting those vacuum secondaries dialed in, whereas I just took the 660s and put them on as they were and run the same exact number for the most part. But those 660s were the ticket later on. I mean, they work. I was really shocked at how much jet I had to pull out of those carbs, because with the annular boosters to make it, because like the first time I put it on the chassis dyno, it was like in the nines as far as air fuel ratio. And it still made more power than the vacuum secondaries did when those carbs were dialed in.
If you had to pick a couple of new things you've learned since working with the tunnel ram, just completely enlightening things you've learned, what would you say they were? Maybe the top 3 things the tunnel ram has taught you from working with it.
It's not as intimidating as what you think. Another thing that we need to talk about we haven't covered is, if you're driving tunnel rams on the street, the importance of having the carbs balanced. I've actually made a tool, and the people at the No Name Nationals got to see me using this tool, where you're balancing the airflow in each carb at idle.
Right.
And the reason for that is, when you're driving that carb around town, both of those carbs have to be like synchronized swimmers with each other, because you got to remember, one carburetor is feeding 4 cylinders and the rear carburetor is feeding the other 4 cylinders. So you've got to have the balance of having this. When you open the throttle blades, they're exactly at the same spot on both carbs. You know,
Probs, Rods, and Streetcars is asking you, are you bringing that truck to No Name Nationals?
yep. That's the game plan.
So look out. 258 days can change a lot of things, but hopefully that won't be one of them.
You're right. I'm ahead of the curve this time, right? At least it's a running, driving vehicle.
He's not in header jail.
Not in header jail. Yeah.
Yeah, Don English. I forgot. Don English is running a 5-barrel. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you guys haven't seen that, if you go to One Eyed Cat's channel, he has a 5-barrel setup on his 440, 4-barrel in the front, and a single barrel Holley 1920 from a slant 6 in the back.
Yeah. But going back to that balance in the carb thing, it really is. It's about like, I seen a comment where it said something about like balancing carbs on a motorcycle. And that's exactly what you're trying to do. And you would not believe the difference in drivability just putting around town that has.
That's basically what Andy had there. You just basically took a carburetor hat and put a vacuum gauge on it, right?
Well, it's Edelbrock used to sell, well, they still sell it. Because back in the early 1950s, when everybody had flatheads and multiple Stromberg carburetors, Edelbrock had this little tool called a unisync. Okay. or unison. And I thought, well, if balancing carbs was important back then, it must be important now. So what I did is I took a carb hat, modified it, put that tool on top of it to make it work.
Yep.
Now I've got to make another one that fits Dominators.
The Volkswagen guys are real familiar with that because it's very, very common to see dual carburetors on a Volkswagen because of the flat forward design. They want to run the shorter intake runners and they'll run a carburetor on each side. And so they have to sync them up the same. All right. What would you say here to Hunter's comment? Some people can tune dual quads better by ear versus gauges.
Well, honestly, after you've done it a few times, like when I first drove Casper, if you watch my video of me driving Casper the first time, I could tell by the sounds of the engine was making which way I needed to go. And the way that only comes is through experience of doing it, but starting out, you have to have something as a reference point. If you don't know what you don't know. And so you have to have aids to help you, like vacuum gauges, wideband, all of that stuff can give you clues as to which way you need to go. But a good old timer probably can, but I would rival that on the street, because when you're trying to do it on the street, you need to be pretty precise in what you're doing.
Use your senses, your eyes, your ears, your common sense on top of the gauges, not in place of them. And you'll get your tune a lot better.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any other questions? We got just a few minutes here.
This has been pretty fun, man. I've had a good time hanging out with you.
I'm glad we can do this more often, man. Just holler at me.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. Appreciate all of the viewers watching and the questions. Hopefully I was able to help you. I mean,
you're always enlightening. We always learn new stuff when we have Andy Wood on. So if you guys have any last question, now's the time to ask them. And how many dart sports were made in 1974?
All of them?
Yeah. No, all but, well, half of them, I guess. They made them they made them 4 years. That's such an unfinished project question.
Yeah.
But if you guys have any last questions, go ahead and get them in. I do want to thank the mods, including one who's sitting in here now, Andy, Joe, Blake, Buzz, Buff, Ari, Fubar. I want to thank you guys. You guys are usually drifting through here and keep all the fun stuff out. And I appreciate that. Hey, and there's the answer. The answer is 63,518. I would say that's true.
Now we know. I can sleep tonight. You know what? That is pretty awesome.
That's it. I was wondering that.
Thanks, Shane. Thanks for getting up with you.
Yeah, he's right. And thank you for being here, Andy. We appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate y'all.
Thank all the mods. I'll real quick let you know what we got coming up on this channel. And sometimes you see Andy, in the comments on this channel. So, he's here on either side of this screen. But, next week we've got Deke Denny, the tech guy for AHRA, our tech official. If you have questions about passing tech, next week will be the one you want to watch. If you have questions about those belts and helmets and roll bars and drive shaft loops and battery hold downs and radiator overflows and all of that stuff, you guys ask us these questions all through the year, which you're welcome to. But next week is the one to watch because we're going to have the tech official, Deke, in the house. So you'll be able to ask him. On the 20th, which is 2 weeks from today, we're going to have Andrew and Calvin Nelson, Nivlac 57, talk about all their crazy fast stuff that they drive and track prep and setup and all that kind of stuff. So that'll be 2 weeks from now. And then on the 27th, we're going to have a special announcement. That'll be interesting. If you're an AHRA member or thinking of becoming an AHRA member, the 27th is really going to be a big day for you. So
you need to join today.
Yeah, I'm telling you, if you're not a member,
We need
there's
to
something
join.
big. There's something big coming for you on the 27th. And then on February the 3rd, we're going to have Tom Sarmento. And he was a mechanic for Warner Brothers who worked on shows like Dukes of Hazzard, BJ and the Bear. He did some stunt work. He's an interesting guy. And if you have any questions about how the General Lees were built, for example, he is the guy to ask. And he'll be on the show on February 3rd. So that's the month coming up. And we hope you guys will join us for any and all of that. You have anything else, Andy? Anything you're working on you want to plug?
Not that I know of. I've got some pretty good content coming up pretty soon, so I have to stay tuned for that. And the cool thing about this Tunnel Ram Live is you're going to get to see me digging into the tuning on Casper now, and the methods that I use and how I go about it. It'll all be in the video, so just watch it and hopefully it does somebody good, you know?
Yeah, you guys might get more out of watching those videos now that you've been in this live to get the methods behind Andy's madness for how he tunes that stuff for success.
Yeah.
So with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank all you guys for being in here. I'll see y'all next week. Thanks, Andy. I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good night, everybody.
All right, and we're out.